He descended upon the plane it had arrived upon, and moved swiftly towards his goal, only to find it waiting with, quite literally, open arms. Well, by open, it was gesturing an incantation and drawing power in waves from over 20 different planes to its form. Such knowledge, he thought. He needed to have this one in his thrall. He approached, pulling raw power from the plane he was in, twisting it to his will and creating a literal storm of threads about him. "Join me!" he shouted across the plain, as he moved even closer. "I think not, Scourge," it said, and a wave of power surged from his many hands, assaulting his senses, sending him reeling. Even his vision, though the most powerful sight bar Chrylsis' own, seemed to blur and then shut down in a flurry of activity as his mind tried to make sense of what was transpiring. Eventually he regained his senses, only to find the creature had gone, leaving nothing, not even a trace of threads of magic it had touched. This by its very nature was impossible, even to his power, as everything that moved through magic touched magic, and left a trace. He had to find this thing and make it his own. He knew more than he, and this could not be so. And to make a fool of him, well, nothing, not even the gods themselves got away with that. But he had no way to track it, or find it, and so he must wait again, and be prepared better for the next meeting. He sought out some of those who had made pacts with the daemons, well, those that had survived, and asked them about it. They knew nothing for the most part, and after he asked, he took them into his form, so as to be sure they were not lying. They were not. Then he turned to an overlord or two that had provided pacts, and did the same. And they fought back with all they had, and he found he was actually enjoying the sport, and allowed it to drag on for a while, instead of just taking them into his form quickly. He was glad he had, shortly after, as the last one he took seemed to know something, that some of the overlords that he had thought he had destroyed had in fact fled from his grasp. Apparently he had not taken all of them, and they were now in hiding, but where? The source did not know, and to make sure he took them in their entirety. No, they knew nothing more. So he had a band of runaway overlords who had sought refuge somewhere, together. Well, well, things were getting stranger by the year, and just as he was considering his next course of action, something else happened that he could not foresee. The spine. He could feel the pull from one of his tainted hosts. The one known as the spine was present upon that prime, and so he left this world for a time, and headed to see what was transpiring on the other battlefront. And what he found was not expected. The sight he beheld was one of wonder, even for him, as a rift was breaking forth seemingly to the very hosts themselves. It sensed as being torn open by divinity, although he knew not from where. Upon an island on this prime, where Spine now stood tearing the power from the rift and keeping the magic from closing it, Spine had found a way to the hosts, and his power was growing beyond his as it sucked away at these powers. He could not let the spine take what was his, and so he stepped into this prime and began to feed upon the magic within to bolster his own. Only here, his power was channeled from a different host than when he was riding through the other prime, and it took him a short time to attune to the new form. Spine sensed his arrival and turned to face him. "Begone, whelp, lest I consume you now!" he shouted, as the divine rift now seemed to be channeling directly into him, empowering him even more so than the last time he had confronted him. Only this time, he sensed that he could not overpower him. Spine was too powerful. "You will not take my right to vengeance, Spine!" he bellowed across the aisle. The Spine lowered his shoulders as though preparing to charge. He gathered his strength and prepared for it, but it never came. As Spine moved across the aisle, each straw crossing hundreds of feet, it was unable to stop as the portal opened up in front of the hurtling juggernaut. But where had this magic come from? No threads had been woven to make this happen. He would have seen it. Spine would have seen it. And there, in the distance, a lone figure stood atop a mountain. As it looked down from its height, it seemed to move its arms, and the portal flickered, and the Spine came hurtling out of it back towards its starting point. And as the Spine left the Prime, the tether to the divine rift was severed. Unsure of what had just happened, Spine careened into a mountain, and the aisle shook violently from the impact. And as Spine picked itself up, it spun around looking for its quarry. He looked on and knew what it was. That armed thing was here, preventing Spine from taking down the gods. So they had an ally in this creature. Perhaps this truly was one of those the Scaled Ones had spoken of. Spine tried to draw from the rift that was now rapidly closing, and realized the tether had been dispersed. Anger immediately flared, and Spine now ignored him and spun to face his armed adversary, screaming out. The voice shook the very air, with such power as to deafen any living creature within miles, and sent shards of rock flying as they exploded from nearby, from the source of the sound. "Thalasiac, I will end you!" And Spine began to channel his power into a raw assault. And it was then he realized just how powerful this daemon was, as the very fabric of reality upon the Prime became scorched from the raw power it threw out at its quarry. He was almost glad he had not been the target of its rage, as the very air itself was purged of magic, and permanent scars were left burnt into the very Prime itself. These scars would never be sealed, and magic began to pour into the Prime from the planes that the threads had originated from. The demonic lair of the Spine. The many-armed creature had a name, it seemed. Thulasiak. This I must remember, he said to himself, as he turned his attention from the fight, and instead took notice of these rifts and the plane of magic seeping through. This magic felt like his own, only it was not actually his. It was Spine's. It was reinforcing Spine as it continued its onslaught against Thalasiak. And although it currently seemed to be a standoff, the rate Spine was gaining power from his home plane, he was sure it would not be long before he could not risk this demon gaining more power. Spine was already too powerful, and so he would aid this creature against his brethren. He stepped into a small portion of the flow of magic from Spine's plane. The sheer force of the raw magic pouring out of the skull was more than he expected. Spine was a lot more powerful than he had anticipated. He had to be stopped now, before he became beyond untouchable. That was to be his mantle, not Spine's. And so he began to feed on the power as it surged forth. Spine was too distracted to realize, and as he tapped the flow, the euphoria he had felt the first time Spine had allowed him to feed hit home again. This force, this power, it was overwhelming. It was of not one Prime, but many. Spine had been eating everything. So many lost, so many taken. Even he had not neared what this one daemon had managed to destroy. He realized there was no way he could stand alone against this thing. He needed help to dethrone this monstrosity. And this Thalasiak was to be it, willingly or not. And so he continued to feed, to drain some of the power being fed to Spine, and the Thalasiak seemed to notice, and he was sure a thread of magic indicated approval of his actions, even as Spine rained down upon it. He was actually impressed by the sheer tenacity and power of this creature. If only it were in his fold. It took a while for the Spine to realize his power was being tapped, and as it turned its attention from Thalasiak towards him, it roared again and lashed out, sending a wave of power toward him. However, he had been bathing in the power he was throwing, and used it to form a barrier. He was buffeted by the impact, but not torn asunder, as he reckoned he might have been without this stolen power. He was now the focus of this rage. Perhaps this was not the best idea he had had this aeon. More and more power tore through the air, ripping more holes into the realm, pouring ever more power into this prime, and it began to dissolve, the very ground becoming as sand, then mud, then shifting to water, then a soup of pure threads. Of course, he let his form suck these threads up like a sponge, and concentrated on standing his ground against the oncoming blasts of greater and greater power. The spine moved toward him slowly and deliberately. He thought for a moment he could actually handle Spine. Until, that is, Spine used his abilities to control his own magic. The very thing he now stood in engulfed him. Those threads that he'd been devouring turned hard as stone, holding him fast, refusing to let him take them without them being torn apart first. Spine truly was an adversary to be wary of. He approached, closing off direct access to that which he had been feeding from his encroaching planar energy, and gathered it to himself to regain some portion of what he had lost fighting him. Spine's form changed to a more sinister one, with evil shards of infinite sharpness. The very edges and tips of these bladed protrusions seemed to cut the very threads of the realms, warping and piercing reality as he advanced towards his prey. He had never seen such abilities before, but he shortly felt the ripping blow of a claw as it rent magic from his form, tearing a way through his barriers of protection. This form of his, these claws, they were deadly for sure, and he was forced back, staggering from the blow. As he looked up from his seeping wound, he tried to dodge the next one, but it caught him full on, sending him high into the air as the strike ripped at his torso. He could feel the newly stripped power slowly begin to seep from him as it poured through these wounds. Yes, this form was very dangerous indeed. As he landed hard, he sensed and then saw a portal begin to form, and Thalassic stepped through it, leaving it open, beckoning him to follow. He did not wish to run, but he could not take Spine, especially now he had been wounded as he was, as his very essence was draining away to the spine, and try as he could not weave his threads back. He cursed this encounter, and moved swiftly toward the portal, shedding his threads as he did, trying to lose this accursed injury with them. As he reached the portal, Spine was right behind him, and sent him sprawling through it with a solid blow to his back. The portal closed. Spine roared, and beset about ravaging that world in anger. It was the start of the death of another Prime that day.